He's not really dead. He is over here. Follow me. William Afton, a man whose insanity and recklessness consumed him in a way that altered the course of his life forever. A once humble entrepreneur turned into a monster nearly overnight. But this isn't exactly our world. Our story takes place in a world where darkness is more than the absence of light. This is a place where the shadow of one's thoughts and actions can become animated with life of their very own. A place where even the criminally insane may begin to fear their own shadow. This is the Remnant Zone.
Happy Halloween, everyone. I thought to honor the spooky season I'd do a spooky theory covering a topic that a lot of you asked that I cover, even though I already covered it. It's alright though, I'm kinda glad I was encouraged to revisit the shadow issue as, well, there's only so much detail you can cram into a short. So come with me as we descend down the dark rabbit hole of the Shadow Animatronics. In FNaF 2, Scott Cawthon arguably went a little bit overboard with the number of characters. With 11 that actively hunt you plus another 4 that can randomly appear and disappear, the game is overwhelming when it comes to its rogues gallery. Mixed in with this cast are 2 mysterious figures, long shrouded in mystery, Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie. These ghostly figures appear at random in the game, with Shadow Bonnie crashing your game, and Shadow Freddy just kind of staring at you. Given the strange nature of these characters and the fact that they begin to appear elsewhere later in the series, it's no wonder people have desperately wanted to know who these figures actually are, or better yet, what they actually are. I'd like to start by recapping my original theory on the shadows from a few months ago. In FNaF 4's minigames in one of the rooms of Fredbear's, purple shadows of the stage animatronics are cast on the wall, apparently scaring the crying child. Of course, given the only characters at Fredbear's were Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, the shadows took on the form of a bear and a bunny. Also, I pointed out the fact that the story Ditophobia from Tales from the Pizzaplex confirms my long-standing theory that the FNaF 4 gameplay is just a weird test chamber used to experiment on intense fear. The story also implies that these test chambers opened in 1983, the same year the crying child died. So, how are these 2 details connected? Well, looking back to the maintenance panel from Night 2 of Sister Location, sure, the FNaF 4 gameplay rooms are on the map, with the main gameplay room labeled Observatory 2, but the FNaF 4 minigame map is on this panel as well. People have long inferred this to mean that Sister Location is connected to the original Fredbear's, but I don't think so. In the panel, this area is labeled Observatory 1. Not only that, it's one of the places we actually restore power to. This entire area, including Fredbear's, the Afton house, and the road connecting them, are all connected in another observation zone. I think this means to tell us that for whatever reason, these fear tests also include a recreation of the map layout from the FNaF 4 minigame. Possibly another chamber that's underground. It's not the original location. So with all of that established, this seems to imply that while testing fear in the FNaF 4 gameplay, William was also doing the same with test subjects trapped in a simulated recreation of the FNaF 4 minigames. But still, the question remains, why? Well, enter the shadows. I think it's possible that sometime around the Bite of 83, the crying child's fear of the animatronic shadows on the wall sprung into something much greater. I believe that shortly after the crying child's death in one way or another, William witnessed these shadowy creatures roaming around. Maybe they were even stalking him. Given he was likely watching Crying Child at every turn through the Fredbear plushie, he likely knew that his son was afraid of the shadows at Fredbear's, shadows that suspiciously resemble the new monsters he had witnessed. From this, he likely made the connection that the fear his son had faced was so strong that it conjured physical monsters into being, monsters that once existed in his mind, which have since spilled out to haunt those unfortunate enough to come across them. Interested by this hypothesis, William set out to study fear more, by constructing test chambers designed to horrify those trapped within. His hope, of course, that one day another one of these beings would come to be, a hope that would eventually come true when the being known as Nightmare formed. Just to be clear, yes, I do think that Nightmare is a being more similar to what the shadows are, rather than just being an illusion like the rest of the nightmares. And this goes beyond the fact that he's a dark-colored Fredbear. If you look closely at Nightmare, he's partially transparent, almost ghost-like, unlike the rest of the nightmares which all look completely solid. Furthermore, his jump scare is incredibly distinct from the rest of the nightmares, being a single frame with an unusual ethereal noise to it, almost as if he's killing you in a much more spiritual way. Furthermore, while the rest of the nightmares with lines in Ultimate Custom Night imply that they were illusions that were then made real, Nightmare says this: Your wickedness made of flesh. If I'm right that Nightmare is conjured from William's fear experiments, this could explain what he means by this. Nightmare is a being that only exists because of the evil William had to go through with the fear test chambers in the first place. The torment of people for his own twisted reasons, keeping them there endlessly. So to recap, this theory states that the Shadow Animatronics are beings that sprung from the fear the crying child had for the shadows at Fredbear's. William went on to study this phenomenon with his fear test chambers as we see in 4, and these tests finally concluded with the conjuration of Nightmare. And if that sounds crazy to you, well, keep in mind, we've seen things like this happen plenty of times in the series, like, repeatedly. In Fazbear Frights, there are a handful of stories that involve people's fear or paranoia, leading to physical, horrific consequences. In the story Bunny Call, from the book of the same name, a man named Bob and his family visit a camp together. As a means to play a prank on his family, Bob signs up for something known as the Bunny Call, where early in the morning, a worker dressed up as the rabbit mascot Ralpho comes to wake everyone up, likely scaring them. After he signs up, Bob starts to get increasingly paranoid that maybe this prank is a little bit too mean, so he stays up to make sure that the bunny call never happens. Ralpho does end up visiting the cabin, however it looks like he's trying to get in at all costs. There comes a point where blood starts to come from the costume due to Bob's more violent attempts to ward him off. Even still, the mascot continues its efforts to break in. The twist of the story is that the bunny call was called off the night prior, as the counselor who dresses up as Ralpho overslept. So the question remains, who the hell was Ralpho? In the story's Step Closer, a kid named Pete becomes paranoid after witnessing Foxy repeat the phrase, "You can be a pirate, but first you'll have to lose an eye and an arm." Throughout the coming days, Pete is put into increasingly dangerous situations where his eye and or his arm are in danger of being removed. This culminates in him rushing back to Freddy's to break the curse from Foxy, before being hit by a car and dying. In death, he is somehow still aware of his surroundings, only to find that as an organ donor, his eye and his arm will be donated. There are other stories with the similar theme of paranoia having disastrous consequences, like Pizza Kit and the Breaking Wheel. For the sake of time though, I'm just sticking with the 2 examples I already gave. With all of that out of the way, I must admit this theory isn't flawless. First, it would beg the question of where the hell Nightmare went after the events of FNaF 4. I mean, if he truly is a physical being and not just an illusion, where did he run off to and why does he never come up again? Also, it's worth mentioning, for those examples I gave for Fazbear Frights, there could be another explanation for the events in the stories than just fear causing things to happen. The epilogues show that most of, if not all of the bad things that happen throughout the Fright stories were in a way perpetuated by the character of Eleanor being born from the evil of Afton's doings. As an example, in the story 1:35 AM, a woman is driven to madness and her eventual death after believing a doll named Ella she had bought was taunting her. The epilogues show that it was actually Eleanor all along. So maybe it isn't fear after all. Maybe in reality, the shadows come from agony, or the reflection of the evil of one's actions. And this leads us to the second theory, and the one I'm starting to lean more towards. For this theory, I'd actually like to start with discussing the Frights books. I already mentioned the character of Eleanor and how she's a being born from the misdeeds of William Afton, but there's another character in the Fright stories that may be a lot more relevant to bring up. Specifically, one of the shadows does appear in the Frights books. Shadow Bonnie in the story Hide and Seek. Long story short, this kid named Toby rages because he can't get a high score on a kid's game and totally destroys the entire game room at Freddy's. From there, his fate is sealed as his shadow starts to grow into the form of Shadow Bonnie. From there, it just kind of follows him around until he dies. And presumably, the shadow disappears as well. So, what can we learn from this? Well, it looks to be that, as Nightmare implies in Ultimate Custom Night, shadows are born from people's misdeeds, or at least Shadow Bonnie is in the context of this story. So could we apply this to the games as well? I honestly think so, and there's plenty of paths to take with this idea. The main idea that popped into my mind is Shadow Bonnie and Shadow Freddy were born from the incidents of death caused by William, one of them being born from Charlie's murder and the other being born from the MCI. Which one's which is hard to tell, but before anyone comes to this conclusion, no, I don't think that the dead children incident was involved with any shadows. By technicality in FNaF 2, Shadow Bonnie can appear as early as Night 1 by pure chance, while Shadow Freddy can appear as early as Night 3, by consequence of that being the first night all of the Wizards can vacate parts in service. Meanwhile, any indication that the DCI happened doesn't begin until Phone Guy's Night 4 call. Plus, whether or not the DCI is actually an event that happened at all, or was just Scott messing up details, is up in the air. Returning to the idea that one of the shadows is associated with Charlie, and the other is associated with the MCI, isn't too far-fetched. Personally, I believe that the form the shadows took all depends on the last Freddy's character the victims actually saw. In Charlie's case, she was either attending Fredbear's or Freddy's before being shut out. Either way, it's likely a bear character would have been displayed at the front of these buildings. In the case of the MCI, well, William killed the kids while dressed as Spring Bonnie, which is why the second shadow takes the form of a rabbit. Yes, I know Shadow Bonnie resembles Toy Bonnie if anything, but it's unclear whether that is a significant detail or if the only significant detail is that it looks like a Bonnie in general. As further support for this idea, in the books it is kind of established that any entity that forms bases its appearance off of the event that caused it to form to begin with. In the case of Hide and Seek, which I already mentioned, Shadow Bonnie was a cardboard cutout in the game that Toby destroyed. However, there's another story that's really interesting that also compares to this idea. In the story Blackbird, again, from the book of the same name, a guy named Noel is stalked by a creature he just calls the Blackbird, which is a, well, dark-looking creature that also looks like a bird, believe it or not. Anyways, this stalking doesn't begin until his friend Sam is reportedly hit by a train while wearing the Blackbird costume. So again, it's this theme of a creature being born from a terrible tragedy and thus taking the form of something involved with the event. This also does work as support for my fear idea I mentioned earlier, because the twist at the end of the story is Sam was never actually hit by the train. He just got injured, and they couldn't find him because he had already fled the scene at that point. So if anything, it looks like Blackbird was born from the fear that Sam had actually died, but we're not talking about that anymore. With this murder consequence theory in mind, I may be able to revisit my old friend, Midnight Motorist, to offer a new perspective on what that minigame means. Those three-toed plump animatronic feet match with Shadow Freddy's pretty well, and with that in mind, this could put us back on the track that maybe Midnight Motorist really does take place the night that Charlie died. After her death, Shadow Freddy is born. He lures the crying child out of his room and into the night for him to stumble upon Charlie's body, which leads to his fear of Fredbears as we see in FNaF 4. Yes, you would have to ignore the fact that the mascot footprints don't go anywhere, they just kind of stand there, but bear with me. Pun entirely intended. The shadows he sees on the wall scare him because they remind him of the creature that led him to the horrific sight of Charlie's corpse. Or, you know, he's just a little kid scared of shadows. Or maybe Shadow Freddy actually led Michael out of his room to stumble upon the corpse of Charlie. I know this begs the obvious question of what would the significance of that be? But my best answer is this could circle back to the conjuration of Nightmare in FNaF 4. Another interesting yet slightly convoluted interpretation of FNaF 4 that I've seen is that while the test chambers did in fact exist, and maybe Michael was stuck in them for some time, the gameplay of FNaF 4 is actually nightmares Mike is having of those tests. This is sort of implied by the security logbook, where Mike responds to a question about having nightmares with a picture of Nightmare Fredbear. Plus, in the actual tests as we see in Didophobia, Fredbear nor Nightmare are present. But maybe when Mike was having nightmares about the test chambers, these characters eventually forced their way into his mind, with Fredbear being born from the repressed trauma of the death of his little brother, nightmare stemming from the horror of the night he was led to Charlie's body. If you really want to push things, you could even make an argument that that's why Nightmarion replaces Nightmare in the Halloween version of the game. In a roundabout way, this would still make Nightmare a being caused by Afton's wickedness, a literal monster in Michael's dreams, inspired by the real monster that led Michael to the first of Afton's many crimes. Personally, I like this idea more because it would also explain the lump in Midnight Motorist being able to be chalked down to the crying child's grave. But anyways, in typical Snorf fashion, I'm sure you're all expecting me to drop a third, unrelated theory on you that I quote-unquote actually believe in. But in the words of Jonathan Frakes,
not this time.
I know it's a weird thing to do for a theory video to end at a fork in the road, but I'm not entirely sure which idea I like better. On one hand, the theory that the shadows were caused by the crying child's fear seems to seamlessly explain why the FNaF 4 test chambers existed to begin with. On the other hand, the theory that the shadows were born from Afton's crimes has a little more weight to it and furthermore explains Midnight Motorist fairly well. But while I leave you all to consider that conundrum, let me drop another distressing point on you. Whether these shadows are beings of fear or agony, one question still remains. Where the hell did they go? Shadow Freddy, from what I can tell, last appears in FNaF 3 in the Follow Me games, and then maybe makes an appearance in the main gameplay if this Easter egg is supposed to be him. Yes, I know that some say that the Dark Freddy and Pizza Sims opening is Shadow Freddy, but I don't think this is him, mostly because I don't think the intro segment is relevant to the story to begin with. Shadow Bonnie actually appeared in the series quite recently, and before anyone drops a comment about this, no, it isn't Rune. That was a silly joke Markiplier and his editors slipped into his video. Where Shadow Body actually does appear is in FNaF AR, where he seems to be guarding Dark Remnant, aka Agony. I'm not really sure, it's hard to say whether or not this appearance is even relevant to the story, but yeah, no matter what the shadows are, they're kind of left in a rough spot where all signs point to them being relevant, yet they just stop appearing at a certain point. If you want my honest thoughts, I am leaning a little bit more towards the second theory. While this does unfortunately put us back to square one in terms of knowing what the FNaF 4 test chambers were built for, it's important to keep in mind that those parallels to fear I mentioned in Faster Frights still exist either way. So maybe in a way both parts of theories are true. That is to say, maybe one of the shadows was conjured from fear, while the other was conjured from a negative event. I mean, looking at Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie, they aren't totally the same looking. Shadow Bonnie is totally black. I think they call that Fanta Black. Shadow Freddy, on the other hand, just looks like a purplish version of Golden Freddy. Also, one of them crashes your game, the other one just stares at you. And fun fact, Shadow Freddy was apparently supposed to run away after you looked at it for too long, but that was eventually removed, so I don't know. It's also important to keep in mind the idea that no matter what these things are, why are they supposedly helping the missing children in Follow Me and the FNaF 3 minigames? I mean, if Shadow Freddy really is the id of William, it kind of seems weird he'd be leading the animatronics directly to him. You could interpret this as William luring the kids for a second time, somehow gaining control of Shadow Freddy, but the character encyclopedia does kind of imply it's trying to help the kids, so I don't know what that's about. Shadow Bonnie, on the other hand, you could make an argument that the minigames aren't really real, by the logic that Shadow Bonnie literally helped a kid find their way to the happiest day. You could apply the same to Toy Chica or Golden Freddy, but I'm not really sure. My best explanation is to think of them more as consequences rather than ids or, well, shadows. That is to say, just because they're born from evil doesn't mean that they stand for the evil. In fact, maybe their process of freeing themselves from existence involves them undoing the harm that they were born from. I'm not really sure. But those are just some thoughts to leave you off on. What do you think about this nonsense? Which one of my theories do you like more? Do you dislike both of them? Let me know in the comments, and if you have any better ideas, I'd love to hear those as well. With all of that aside, I'll see you all next time.